Cape Alava sits at the westernmost point of the contiguous United States, a low shoulder of rock and rainforest, where the Olympic Peninsula finally runs out of land and gives way to open Pacific. There is no road to it. To stand there in the winter of 1969, you would have had to walk in through spruce and salal, past driftwood stacked in windrows by decades of storms, to a beach terrace above the tide line where the grass grew a little too even and a little too green for anyone to think much of it. In February of 1970, a winter storm came off that same ocean and tore into the bluff above the beach, and when the wind and the tide pulled back, they left something behind that no map, survey, or timber count had ever recorded. Chunks of the bank had sheared away in the weather, and where solid earth had been, there was now a raw wound of dark clay cut into the hillside. Sticking out of that clay were cedar planks, cut and squared by hand, still lying at the angle they had fallen. Alongside the planks were baskets. Cordage, twisted and coiled the way it had been twisted and coiled by someone's hands 5 centuries earlier. Wooden boxes with fitted, folded corners and lids that still sat where they belonged. Fish hooks, war clubs, pieces of whaling gear, all of it soft with age and yet whole, as though the mud had not buried a village so much as it had simply paused one. This is the Ozette Indian Reservation, land belonging to the Makah people, since time immemorial, and recognized by the Treaty of Nea Bay in 1855, the same treaty that remains to this day the only one in the United States to explicitly preserve a tribe's right to hunt whales. The storm had opened a door into that history that had been sealed for roughly 500 years. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What the wind and tide exposed was not a rumor, and it was not folklore invented after the fact to explain an empty stretch of coast. Makah oral history had spoken for generations of a great slide, a catastrophe that swallowed part of the village of Ozette long before any European ship entered the strait, and for just as long that story had lived the way oral histories often live outside the institutions that write official history, respected inside the community that carried it, and treated as color, not evidence, everywhere else. The storm of 1970 did not create a mystery. It confirmed one that had been sitting in plain sight the whole time, waiting for the water to move. Ozette had never fully emptied out even before the storm made headlines. Families connected to the village continued to live there seasonally into the 1920s, hunting seal, fishing, and gathering along a coastline their ancestors had worked for thousands of years before them, which means the site the archaeologists eventually excavated was never a lost city in the way the phrase gets used elsewhere. It was a home that had partly gone quiet within living memory, not a civilization erased so long ago that no one was left to remember its name. What you are looking at, in the photographs taken in the weeks after the storm, is a hillside stripped raw by erosion, a dark, thick band of clay cutting through it at the height of a grown man's shoulders. Beneath that clay, buried on their sides, were the remains of what excavation would eventually document as 6 longhouses, cedar plank structures built along the beach terrace at Ozette by a whaling people who had occupied this stretch of coastline for thousands of years before the slide ever came down. This was not the first time an archaeologist had stood on that terrace. Richard Doherty, then a young archaeologist, had recorded the site during a survey of the outer Washington coast as early as 1948, and he did not forget it. 2 decades later, as a professor at Washington State University, he returned to run field school excavations at Ozette in 1966 and again in 1967, working with a small multidisciplinary team that included the geologist Roald Frixell, the archaeologist Carl Gustafsson, and staff member Harvey Rice, with support from the National Science Foundation. Their test pits were narrow, and what came out of them was a hint rather than a village, enough wet, waterlogged organic material to tell Doherty that something unusual was preserved in that ground. At the very end of the 1967 field season, his crew located the edge of the first buried house. Then the funding ran out, the field school ended, and the site went quiet again for 3 more years, until the storm did what patient digging alone had not yet managed, and opened the whole record at once. The materials that came out of that clay were not what anyone expects from an archaeological site on the Pacific coast of North America. Wood does not survive the centuries in most soil conditions. It rots, it is eaten by insects and microorganisms, it returns to the ground within a human lifetime or two, and this is exactly why so much of what we know about pre-contact life on this coast comes down to us through stone tools, shell middens, and bone, the durable fraction of a culture that has otherwise vanished without a trace. But the Ozette slide had done something the ordinary passage of 500 years should have undone completely. The clay it deposited sealed the buried longhouses in an airless, waterlogged pocket, and in that pocket, without oxygen to feed the bacteria and fungi that break organic material down, wood behaved less like an archaeological specimen and more like a message left in a bottle. Cedar planks that should have been dust were still cedar planks. Baskets that should have been unrecognizable fragments still held their weave, tight and countable, thread by thread. A wooden box built with a fitted, folded corner still opened the way it had been built to open 500 years before. The Makah Tribal Council understood immediately what the storm had uncovered and moved fast, because a beach exposure is not a vault. Every incoming tide threatened to finish what the storm had started and simply carry the remaining material out into the Pacific for good. The council contacted Doherty, whose relationship with the tribe and the site already stretched back to those 1966 and 1967 test pits. And Doherty, in turn, worked to secure the university backing and outside funding needed to mount a full excavation before the ocean claimed the rest of it. What followed was not a quiet academic dig, conducted at a leisurely pace over a single field season. It became an 11-year undertaking, run jointly by Washington State University and the Makah tribe, staffed by university students and tribal members working side by side on the beach at Cape Alava from 1970 through 1981. The technique itself tells you something about what they were dealing with. Ordinary excavation, the careful scrape of a trowel through dry or lightly damp soil, would have torn the waterlogged wood apart before it ever left the ground. Instead, crews used pressurized water hoses to gently wash the surrounding clay away from each buried timber and object, freeing artifacts from their 500-year casing, the way a hand might loosen a stone from wet sand, patiently and without force. Photographs from the early 70s show plastic sheeting stretched across sections of the excavation between working hours, to keep the exposed deposits from drying out, because a piece of ancient cedar that had survived half a millennium underwater could crack and disintegrate within days if it were simply left uncovered in the open air. The site had to be kept wet to stay whole. It had survived 5 centuries in the dark. It could be lost in an afternoon of sun. Getting each object out of the ground was only the first problem. Keeping it intact afterward was the harder one, and it required a second, quieter kind of science that had nothing to do with trowels or water hoses. Waterlogged wood that has spent 500 years underground is mostly water by volume, its cell structure hollowed out and propped up only by the moisture sitting inside it. Simply air dry a piece like that, and the wood collapses in on itself as the water leaves, warping and cracking into something unrecognizable within days. Conservators working with the Ozette material turned to a technique developed for exactly this problem, soaking artifacts for months or years in a solution of polyethylene glycol, a wax-like compound that slowly replaces the water inside the wood cell by cell, so that when the piece is finally dried, something solid is left behind to hold the original shape instead of empty space. Basketry and cordage, too fine and fibrous for that treatment, were stabilized through careful freeze-drying instead, drawing the moisture out as ice rather than liquid, so the delicate weave never had the chance to sag or tear. None of this was fast. Some pieces from the 1970s excavation were still undergoing conservation treatment years, in some cases decades, after they came out of the clay, which is part of why the laboratory work at Neah Bay was never a short-term project bolted onto the excavation. It became its own long undertaking, running parallel to the dig, and then continuing well after the last unit at Cape Alava had been closed and backfilled. Over those 11 years, the Ozette excavation produced more than 55,000 individual artifacts, drawn from at least 4, and by some counts 6, large cedar plank longhouses. Whaling harpoons came up out of the mud, along with the sealed, air-filled floats once used to tire a struck whale. Wooden clubs, combs, toy canoes small enough for a child's hand, resting alongside the full-sized fishing and hunting gear their parents had carried. Woven basketry and cordage twisted from cedar bark. Sleeping mats, cradles built for infants who lived and grew inside houses that would, within their own or their children's lifetimes, be buried by their own hillside. Bone needles for sewing, digging sticks, wooden bowls and spoons still bearing the marks of the tools that shaped them. Among the ceremonial objects recovered was a carved cedar effigy of a whale's dorsal fin, inlaid with more than 700 individual sea otter teeth, arranged in the shape of a thunderbird gripping a snake in its claws, an object used in the ceremonies that accompanied whale hunting. The mud flow had shattered it on its way down. Years later, in a laboratory in Nia Bay, a Washington State University staff member and a Makah student sat down together and pieced the fragments back into one carving, tooth by tooth, until the thunderbird held its snake again. Radiocarbon testing placed the slide itself at roughly 500 years before the excavation, plus or minus 50, putting the disaster sometime in the 16th or 17th century, a full century or more before Ozette's residents would have had any sustained contact with a European ship. The village did not vanish because of contact, disease, or displacement. It was buried by its own hillside, on an ordinary day, in weather no one outside the village recorded, because no one outside the village was there to record it. The multidisciplinary approach Doherty had insisted on from the start, back in 1966, when he brought in a geologist and a zoologist alongside the archaeologists, rather than treating the dig as a strictly cultural excavation, paid off across the full 11 years of work. Geological analysis of the slide itself helped date not just the objects inside it, but the event that buried them, distinguishing the deposit from ordinary soil accumulation and confirming it as a single, catastrophic mudflow rather than a gradual burial over time. Botanical and faunal remains recovered alongside the artifacts filled in details the wooden objects alone could not: what people at Ozette were eating, what timber they were choosing and why, which species of shellfish and fishbone turned up most often in the debris around each hearth. None of that came from the artifacts a museum visitor notices first, the carved whale fin or the harpoon heads, but it built the surrounding picture that let archaeologists say with confidence not just what these people made, but how they lived, season to season, inside houses that would eventually be buried by the same hillside that had sheltered them. What the excavation confirmed, house by house, was a level of architectural sophistication that a casual visitor standing on that beach in 1969 would never have guessed was buried beneath their boots. The longhouses were framed with heavy posts and beams, roofed and walled with hand-split cedar planks, built with a consistency in scale and construction across the structures that speaks to shared technique passed down with real precision, not improvised on the spot house by house. Woodworking tools recovered from the site, the wedges, mauls, and adzes used to split and shape the planks, matched the tool marks still visible in the wood itself, so archaeologists could trace a specific cut on a specific board back to the specific implement that made it. This was not raw survival carpentry thrown up against a hard coastline. It was a mature building tradition, refined across generations, executed by people who understood exactly what a length of cedar could be made to do, and who built homes meant to shelter extended families for years, not seasons. Ozette did not stand alone as evidence of what this stretch of coastline could preserve when conditions were right, and that matters, because a single anomalous find is easy enough to wave off as a fluke of circumstance. A pattern is harder to dismiss. A few years after excavation began at Cape Alava, Doherty and his colleagues turned their attention roughly 20 miles east, to a site along the Hoko River, where a similar combination of waterlogged, low-oxygen mud had sealed away an ancient fishing camp on the riverbank. Work at Hoko River, beginning in the late 1970s, recovered basketry, cordage, and wooden fishing gear that in some cases predated the Ozette material by well over 1,000 years, among the oldest basketry ever recovered anywhere on the North American continent. Two sites, separated by 20 miles of coastline and by more than 1,000 years of use, both preserved by the same accident of wet clay and cut-off oxygen, both defying the ordinary rule that wood does not last. The Hoko River material told a story that ran even further back than Ozette's. Where the Ozette longhouses captured a single community in the last few centuries before sustained European contact, the Hoko site preserved the residue of a seasonal fishing camp used and reused across a span of more than 2,000 years, its fish weirs, netting and cordage layered into the riverbank the way rings build up inside a tree. Researchers working the site could trace changes in hook design, in the twist and material of the cordage, in the technique behind the weirs themselves, across a timeline long enough to watch a fishing technology evolve in place, generation after generation, on the same stretch of river. That kind of long, continuous record almost never survives on the wet, acidic soils of the Pacific Northwest. Bone dissolves, wood rots. Basketry, which is built from some of the most perishable material a culture produces, is normally gone within a century, if that. Hoko River and Ozette sit 20 miles apart on the same peninsula, and between them they preserved artifact classes separated by more than 1,000 years of use, simply because the mud in both places happened to seal out the air before decay had the chance to finish its work. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The third site in the pattern comes from a different discipline entirely, and it starts not with an archaeologist but with a farmer. In 1977, Emmanuel Manis was digging a pond on his property near Sequim, not far to the east of the Ozette and Hoko River sites, when his backhoe struck bone. What came up out of that ground was the skeleton of a mastodon, and lodged inside one of its ribs, with new bone growth partially healed around it, was a sharpened bone point. Carl Gustafson, the same Washington State University archaeologist who had worked the earliest Ozette test pits a decade before, examined the find and argued that the point had been driven into the animal by a hunter while it was still alive. Radiocarbon dating placed the bone at roughly 13,800 years before the present, which would put human beings on this coastline well before the Clovis culture that mainstream American archaeology had long treated as the first human presence anywhere in the Americas. For decades, the claim was met with open skepticism inside the field. The idea that people were already here, already hunting mastodon with worked bone weapons, before the timeline the discipline had settled on, did not fit the accepted model, and the Manis point sat in a kind of scientific limbo, cited in footnotes but never fully accepted, its finder largely alone in defending it at conferences where the prevailing view simply assumed he had to be wrong. The vindication did not come from a fresh excavation. It came from instruments the original dig never had access to. In 2011, a team led by the archaeologist Michael Waters used computed tomography scanning and protein residue analysis, techniques unavailable to Gustafson in the 1970s, to re-examine the rib and the object embedded in it, and their study, published in the journal Science, confirmed what Gustafson had argued all along. The object was indeed a bone projectile point, driven into the animal while it lived, consistent with a hunting strike rather than any natural process of breakage or decay. What makes the Manis case worth sitting with is not simply that Gustafson turned out to be right, but how long the discipline was willing to let the question sit unresolved, rather than revisit it seriously. For the better part of 3.5 decades, the mastodon rib sat in university storage, cited in survey papers as an outlier, an oddity, a claim that could not be fully dismissed because the bone itself was real, but that could not be accepted either because it did not fit the Clovis first model most of American archaeology had settled into by the middle of the 20th century. It took a new generation of researchers with new instruments, willing to look again at material that had already been sitting in storage for 34 years, before the question actually got answered instead of simply argued about. Gustafsson lived to see it. He was 75 years old when the 2011 study confirmed what he had been saying since 1977, and he died 5 years later, in 2016, having spent nearly 4 decades being treated in his own field as a man who had likely gotten something wrong. 3 sites, all within a short drive of one another on the same peninsula. 3 different kinds of evidence: wood, basketry, and bone. 3 separate moments when an accepted timeline or an accepted skepticism had to bend to what the ground, or in one case a farmer's backhoe, had actually turned up. None of it required a hidden hand or a buried conspiracy to explain. It required patience, better instruments, and enough time for the science to catch up to what the coastline had been holding on to the entire time. What survives of Ozette today does not sit scattered across distant museum storage, the way so many archaeological collections from indigenous sites across North America have historically ended up, shipped off to institutions far from the communities whose ancestors made them. Under the leadership of tribal chairman Edward Claplanhu, the Makah opened their own museum in Nia Bay in 1979, soon after the site was unearthed, built specifically to house and interpret what had come out of the ground at Cape Alava. The Makah Cultural and Research Centre still stands there today, and in 1993 it added an environmentally controlled curatorial facility built to hold the entire Ozette collection permanently, along with laboratory and office space for the conservation work that continues on some of the more fragile organic material even now. The 55,000 artifacts recovered from Cape Alava are housed there, on Makah land, cared for and interpreted under tribal authority rather than handed over to a university or a museum thousands of miles away. The Ozette Indian Village archaeological site itself was added to the National Register of Historic Places in January of 1974, its exact location listed publicly as address restricted, a designation meant to protect what remains of the site from the same kind of casual disturbance that first exposed it to the world. The excavation closed in 1981, but the collection was never scattered the way so many others have been. What came out of the ground went home, and it stayed there. That decision was not the ordinary outcome for a site of this scale anywhere else on the continent. The default pattern, repeated for more than a century of American archaeology, sent the objects one way and the descendants of the people who made them another, the artifacts crated up for a university collection or a national museum, far from the community that had produced them, the community left to visit its own history behind glass in a city it may never have reason to travel to. Ozette broke that pattern almost from the moment the storm exposed it, because the Makah Tribal Council was involved from the first phone call, rather than being informed after the fact, because tribal members worked the excavation alongside university students for all 11 years, rather than being kept to the sidelines of their own history, and because the museum built to hold the collection went up in Nia Bay, on the reservation rather than in Pullman or Seattle or Washington, D.C., visitors who want to see the whale fin effigy, the harpoons, the toy canoes, and the 55,000 other objects recovered from that beach terrace still have to travel to the same stretch of coastline the objects came from, to a museum owned and run by the same tribe whose ancestors built the 6 longhouses in the first place. Consider what the full record actually requires you to accept, once you lay it out beside itself in order. A community's oral history, carried across generations with no written record to back it, described a catastrophe at Ozette long before any archaeologist ever picked up a trowel on that terrace. Outside experts, on the rare occasions they heard the story at all, treated it the way institutions have so often treated oral tradition passed down without paper behind it, as local colour rather than evidence worth testing. Doherty listened to it anyway in 1966, dug 2 seasons of test pits on the strength of it, and found enough to keep him interested even after the funding dried up. Then a storm did in a single week what patient digging alone had not yet managed, and the ground gave up 6 longhouses exactly where the story said a village had been buried, On a timeline, the radiocarbon dating would go on to confirm almost precisely 500 years, give or take 50. The people who had been right about Ozette for centuries were the people whose account had never been written down at all. That is the shape worth sitting with once the last artifact has been logged and the last house plan drawn. Not a hidden history erased by force, and not a suppressed truth kept from the public by any institution with something to protect, but a true history that had simply never been asked for in a form anyone outside the community was prepared to accept, carried instead inside a people until the coastline itself broke open on an ordinary winter night and made the outside world stop and look. 20 miles up the coast at Hoko River, cordage that predated Ozette by 1,000 years told the same kind of story in a different key. That wet, oxygen-starved ground on this peninsula has been keeping secrets far older than anyone assumed a temperate rainforest coastline could keep. And a short drive to the east, in a farmer's half-dug pond, a bone point sat lodged in a mastodon's rib for 13,800 years, waiting for a scanner that would not exist until 2011, to finally say, without room for argument, that the man who found it and the archaeologist who first read it correctly had been right from the beginning. None of the three stories needed a villain to make them worth telling. No agency buried the mastodon rib on purpose, and no institution set out to keep the Ozette slide a secret from the world. What happened in each case was slower and in its own way more human than that. A discipline settled into a model it found comfortable and treated anything that did not fit as an error to be explained away rather than a lead to be followed. A community kept a memory alive across generations with no paper to back it, because paper was never the form their history took, and had no reason to expect that memory would be believed until the ground did the convincing for them. And in both cases, what finally forced the issue was not a change of heart inside the institutions involved, but a piece of physical evidence that simply would not stay quiet, a storm that would not wait for a research grant, a backhoe that struck bone on an ordinary afternoon in a pond that was never meant to be anything more than a pond. The cedar at Ozette is still cedar. The thunderbird still holds its snake in 700 sea otter teeth, reassembled fragment by fragment in a small room in Nia Bay by two people, one from the university and one from the tribe, working the same puzzle from opposite directions until it closed. The basketry at Hoko River still holds its weave after longer than most of recorded human history. And the point is still lodged in the rib, where it was driven almost 14,000 years ago, in a place no one had any reason to think it would be, by a hand no report and no committee ever got the chance to erase, because the ground itself had already decided to keep the record long before anyone thought to ask it to. Stand on that beach terrace at Cape Alava today. If you make the walk-in past the spruce and the salal and the driftwood stacked in windrows, and there is very little left to see. The units have been backfilled. The grass has grown back over ground that gave up 55,000 objects across 11 years of careful work. Nothing marks the spot for a casual visitor, and that is by design as much as by accident. The address kept restricted on the same public register that first protected the site in 1974. What is left instead is a museum on the reservation at Nia Bay, built and run by the people whose ancestors lived in those 6 longhouses, holding the record their own oral history had been holding all along, only now with 55,000 pieces of physical evidence sitting alongside it, so that no one standing in that gallery ever has to take the story on faith again. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.